direction of travel as opposed to destination is one I think about all the time now, because we usually think, what's the end goal here?
Yeah.
And it'll change, because I can say, you can barely talk in absolutes, right? But I can almost say with certainty, I've never interviewed a founder who said, I had this idea for this business, and then I knew what it was going to end up like. And then I started, and then I built it out exactly to my plan, and then I sold it exactly as I
amen,
planned.
brother. Oh, stop. I can relate to that.
Zero
Yeah.
times. It's usually like, so I had this idea, then I started, and it turns out it was absolutely terrible. And I had to pivot's overused. I had to change the idea, change the idea. That's why I go on the whole idea of experiments, because you have to think in an experimental nature about everything.
Hi there, and welcome to Stock Club, a podcast brought to you by MyWallSt. We have a special episode for you coming this week. Joining Emmet today is Gary Fox, the host of the Entrepreneur Experiment, one of Ireland's top business podcasts. Gary was a great guest, and this is a really fascinating interview. But before we get into it, a word from our sponsors at Vodafone Ireland and their new cloud-based unified communications product, Vodafone UC. This is a technology that integrates various communication and collaboration tools into a single system. These tools typically include voice, video conferencing, instant messaging, email, and file sharing. All the good stuff. Basically everything we use in business. They've partnered with RingCentral to roll out Vodafone UC for organisations of all sizes in Ireland. This is great for business. It's already available in countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany, and the UK. And this solution allows businesses to facilitate seamless communication and collaboration from virtually any device, anywhere, at any time. With this offering, Vodafone Business Ireland and RingCentral are helping businesses adapt to the evolving landscape of hybrid work. Now, into the interview with Gary.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stock Club. I'm delighted to be joined today by Gary Fox, the founder and host of The Entrepreneur Experiment, which is a podcast and a project dedicated to uncovering the secrets and systems that successful entrepreneurs use to excel in their business. And the main goal of The Entrepreneur Experiment is to create a blueprint for launching a profitable business within 12 months. Now, Gary's podcast features interviews with successful entrepreneurs who share their experiences and their strategies and tips for success. And episodes include people like Declan Ryan, who's the founder of Ryanair, Pat Dooley, Stephen Bartlett, and many more. And he also had some aspiring Irish entrepreneurs during COVID times as well, including yours truly. Gary, you're very welcome.
That was a wonderful plug as well at the end, by the way. So natural.
A plug for myself. There you go.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's brilliant.
Look, Gary, I was a guest on your podcast. We were just discussing probably 4 years ago, and I thought it was only fair to turn the mic in your direction now, because you really have interviewed the great and good of business from around the world, and there's so many learnings that I, as a stock investor, can take from you. But what I'd like to do is, as they say, start at the beginning. And could you just give us a quick oversight, or a kind of overview, of the inspiration behind The Entrepreneur Experiment?
Yeah, it really was an experiment, Emmet, because I was running a property management company at the time. And I'd become quite siloed in what I was doing. Like, I had bootstrapped it from €500 to 500,000 turnover a year. And I was doing well, but I had become quite siloed. I wasn't really meeting inspiring people. I loved continually learn. And I was starting to listen to a lot of podcasts in the US. And I was like, these are more like entertainment than they are information or education. It's not really that relevant for us to listen to someone going, oh yeah, we did a small raise to start with, just 50 million. And you're kind of going, okay, interesting. Like, I love origin stories. I love figuring out what makes people tick, especially founders. So I was like, right, I need more mentors. What can I do? And then I started reaching out to people and said, do you want to come on my podcast? I was like, right, I'm going to launch a podcast. And ironically, you mentioned it there, but I hadn't actually thought of it in a while. I was like, oh, the experiment will be, I'll launch a side business on top of my existing business and document everything. And within 4 weeks, I realized there was a massive flaw in that problem, in that you can't document your current business because you have too many stakeholders. You have staff, you have suppliers, you have people, you have prospective customers,
Yeah.
and giving kind of an insight under the hood affects too many people. So I was like, okay, I'm really enjoying the podcast, but what actually started to happen was the episodes with guests started to get really popular. And I just kind of moved slowly into having more and more and more guests. I'd still document my own journey, and I've kind of done that well, but I focused on myself, not kind of businesses, because it's unfair to kind of like publicize other people's business. So that's kind of how it's evolved. And it really, you touched on it there, it's just evolved into this machine of interviewing top tier founders. And I've actually almost shifted direction away from the business side of it, purely into the founder side. It's all about the founder's story, because as I've gone through, and we'll talk about this over the course of the next hour, it's psychology. It's all psychology.
It really is.
Managing your own and then managing others, but always starting with managing your own.
You touched on something there which is really fascinating to me, which was the need for a mentor was one of the catalysts for you starting the show. I think that's incredible, because one thing I've spotted amongst entrepreneurs is their openness to finding mentors, asking you to be a mentor, me asking people to be my mentor, and also the realization that somebody has been your mentor without ever sticking that label on them. You realize and go, wow, that person guided me down a path that I didn't even know existed. How do you think aspiring entrepreneurs and business people and young people and old people alike can find and cultivate mentor relationships? I mean, you and I have a very privileged position that we're hosting a podcast and can reach out to people and make friends along the way who help us. But how should let's say a 31-year-old female engineer working in a tech business go about finding a mentor?
That's a super question. And you touched on something before I answer that. You touched on something brilliant there. They don't have to know they're your mentor. And you can actually be mentoring them in reverse. I think, and I used to do this. I was 100% guilty of this, of putting people on a pedestal. Going, oh, I'd love if so-and-so was my mentor. But because you put them on such a high pedestal, you actually don't reach out to them. And if you do, it's kind of awkward. So like, I have a very clear plan for how you should reach out to people. It's be completely transparent about what you're asking for. Don't ask for, hey, can we go for a coffee in a week's time? Vague, completely non-specific. You're making it their problem to go, no one wants to go for coffee with strangers, as interesting as you are. So what's the hook? What are you actually asking them? Emmet, I actually have 50,000 euro. I really want to invest it in some investable assets. Could you meet me for 30 minutes? Now, obviously, that's your job, so you're not going to do it for free. But for me, if someone asks me, I get this 10 times a week. I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Can you meet me for coffee? I don't even know where to start with that, because most people actually don't want to do it. So what I'll do is I'll introduce a little bit of friction and say, right, what are the top 3 questions you want me to answer about starting a podcast? And 80% of people don't write back.
Really?
So there's my first tip, is that number 1, be specific about why you're reaching out, and make sure you know why you're reaching out. Not that I just fancy spend some time with Emmet. You're busy. I'm busy. Everyone who is worth chatting to should be too busy to meet you. There's the rub of getting a mentor, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who is worth meeting should be too busy. They should be like, I do not have time. I have a family. I have my training. I have my business, I have my investments, I have a million other things I should be doing. So for someone to give you, and we'll talk about this later, like the only thing we have that's the most important is time. Cliche alert, but it's true. And as people get more successful, they have less of it. So for you to take 30 minutes of it, you have to be really clear. And the ironic thing is, on the complete flip side, most people are really, really, really good about helping people on the way up.
Yeah.
They are. How hard it is.
Yeah.
It's just approaching them in the right way, with the right medium, and at the right time. Ideally, tack it on to something they're already going to be at, which is kind of a hack if you're smart about it. Conferences are largely a waste of time if you go there just to look at the speakers. But if you go there to say, I'm going to meet these 4 people, I've really wanted to meet them for a while. It's like anything. Have a plan. Don't just knee-jerk DM Gary on LinkedIn and say, hey, can we meet you for coffee next week? Have a plan and go, okay, I really want to meet Emmet. I think he's going to be speaking at here, here, and here. I'm going to ping him a message and say, I'm going to be at StockCon 2024. Would you have 15 minutes to speak to me about X, Y, and Z. Chances are you're going to go, yeah, cool. Sound like an interesting person. You know, I always say there's two things I try be with guests and the people I find that are most interesting when I chat to. Be interested and be interesting.
Yeah.
So what are you bringing to the table on the flip side? Because really good people tend to be naturally curious. They're going to want to meet you and go, what are you working on? And I can always tell when I meet like really great entrepreneurs, the really good ones, who go, what story is this podcast anyway? How does it work? How do you make money? How do you do it? When do you do it? Like, they just have these questions. So don't overlook what you will also bring to the table, would be my advice for anyone seeking a mentor, is like, have a look at yourself first before you start looking at anyone else and go, what am I doing that's pretty interesting? And what am I going to do that's pretty interesting? What's my mission? Because if you reach out to someone and go, oh, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. I've had this loads of times. I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Okay, what you going to do it on? I'm going to talk to interesting people. It's just a red flag, no plan, no real thought gone into it.
Yeah.
You're asking them to figure out your problem. So say, look, I am starting a podcast. I'm going to speak to elite athletes from the athletic space, and I'm going to document their journey to the next Olympics. Deadly. Cool. I get the narrative.
The role of a great mentor just can't be underplayed, and you will look back and find there was a person who fundamentally changed an element of how you behave and a hack towards your definition of success. And I'm a big believer in it as well. And it's very hard to say no to people. I will always, my base rule is never say no. But I do like the idea of just create a little bit of friction so you're not meeting everyone. Before we dive into my usual line of conversation and the formula that we usually run on Stock Club, I'd like for him to talk about the importance of mental and physical health in entrepreneurship and in business and in life in general. And first up to you, Gary, is there any practices that you've casually noticed are broadly common to the hundreds of successful people you've interviewed?
It's a really interesting one, because you also have to know where you don't want to go.
Yeah.
I've kind of learned that from chatting to people as well.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Who I've previously really admired and kind of looked at them from the outside in going, oh, wow, look at them.
Right.
Look how successful they are.
Yeah.
And then you meet them, their health is appalling.
Really?
You literally see they're in really bad health. Their mental health is really appalling. So I go business, brain, body. I try to talk about those three different pillars, because to me that's how I kind of structure my thinking about my life. And I have family and fun as kind of two separate sub elements of that. But you have to look after number one first, because if you're not looking after yourself, you're not going to look after your business, you're not going to look after your family, you're not going to look after your investments. So I see Ireland is actually a little bit behind when it comes to looking after yourself. It's almost seen as having notions or being a little bit vain. We are accelerating rapidly. The younger generation in their 20s, health is priority number one. They are so fit. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
To a gym,
yeah.
And you're like, it's like walking into Men's Health. Everyone is ripped to bits. It's unbelievable. Yeah. And I'm like, I love it, because it's so inspiring to see. Like, people in their 20s are like, nah, I'm not going to boozing every week because I'm training on Saturday morning.
That's right.
I've got a race on Sunday. You know, they've really adopted the new lifestyle. Whereas I think there's a lot of legacy issues around health in Ireland in terms of like, I look after myself when I've got the business sorted. It's not an either or. And the really good ones I've noticed, the really, really high performers, I've realized that years ago. Generally, you'll see them work out every day.
Really?
Generally, you'll see them work out every day. Yes, absolutely. They will do something. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, I do 2 hours in the gym every day.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that. As long as you make the time.
Yeah.
Generally, it's first thing in the morning. I see that all the time.
Yeah.
It's generally really early, because that's controllable time. After that, it's not controllable time. Controllable time is like from, say, 5 to 8, when they're not actually on the clock with their business or their family or whatever it is. The controllable times is, that's their time. They'll get up an hour early and get it done.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, that sets the momentum and tone for the day. So I've definitely taken that from them. I've definitely taken that. Just get up an extra hour early and just get it done, because it just sets the tone. And it's the momentum of, are you stacking tiny wins or tiny losses? That's what I think about everything in life, fundamentally, from my health to my business to my mental health. It's just stack tiny wins every day. They don't have to be huge, just that 1%.
Are there other small rituals in the sphere of health and well-being that you swear by, like vitamins or yoga? Do you lift weights? Do you do cardio? Like what so you get up every morning. What would you do in that hour, whatever it is you set aside?
So it'll generally go weights one day, cardio the next
Right,
day, kind
gotcha.
of like on, off, on, off, on, off.
Yeah.
And that kind of keeps me mentally stimulated then as well, because I don't get
Yeah.
bored. I
I'm
think
the exact same.
the
I'm
thing
the
is, if
exact
you're
same.
doing something where you're like, it's a grind,
Yeah.
it's like anything. Like the best, someone asked me yesterday, what's the best gym in such an area? I was like, the best one's the one you'll go to.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter, like, because we're like, oh, it's got all this slick equipment, and that's the 20%. The 80% is just getting to a gym and doing something.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
we overthink everything. We
Yeah.
make everything really complicated, and especially stuff we don't really know that much about. And people go, oh, what supplements? What routine? It's like, get to the gym, eat whole foods. Like, I take loads of supplements, but I also eat like really, really well. I'll actually track what I'm eating just to make sure I'm tracking to eat really, really well.
Nice.
Generally whole foods, and the rest of the supplements then are the obvious stuff like vitamin D, vitamin C, your omegas. Now, what I do, one thing I do for my health, which isn't huge, it had a massive change in how I approached my health and how I looked at everything, really, was getting my bloods done twice a year.
Oh, yeah.
With a longevity doctor. So I
Oh,
get it
really?
done every year, every 6 months. Yeah,
Interesting.
I
Okay,
get a
before we
full
move
panel.
on, plug the doctor. Who is that?
It's Dr. Sam Van Eden, and it's newest cell. The thing is, he's so busy. I always caveat it with everyone now. I'm going, I started going with him 2019, and
Right.
like, it was only kind of, it was like, you go to a quack doctor to get your bloods done? What's wrong with you? And I was like, there's nothing wrong with me. I just want to make sure nothing is wrong with me.
So
It's phenomenal, because it just made me think of everything differently, because
Oh,
you know,
entirely.
we kind of think, oh, like, it's just preventative as opposed to, like, you know, I don't want to go to the doctor when I'm sick. I want to go to the doctor and make sure I don't get sick.
Yeah. It's a conversation we've never had on Stock Club, this one here, because we've recorded not as many podcasts as you have, but in the 250 or so episodes, we talk about the stock market. We talk about good, bad, and indifferent investments and leaders, and all we talk about is the result and the pursuit. But as an individual, what hacks can you bring into your life to just make sure you have a long and healthy life is such an important conversation. But on the topic of number of podcasts, you've done about 350 or thereabouts. What have been some of the most surprising insights or lessons that you've learned from some of your guests? Is there any standout moment, either from a guest perspective or just thematically, that rewired how you think or even how you do what you do?
Yeah.
Really?
There's a good few.
Wow.
Direction of travel as opposed to destination is one I think about all the time now, because we usually think, what's the end goal here?
Yeah.
And it'll change, because I can say, you can barely talk in absolutes, right? But I can almost say with certainty, I've never interviewed a founder who said, I had this idea for this business, you know, and then I knew what it was going to end up like. And then I started, and then I built it out exactly to my plan, and then I sold it. Exactly as I
amen,
planned.
brother. Oh, stop. I can relate to that.
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero times. It's usually like, yeah, so I had this idea. Then I started, and it turns out it was absolutely terrible. And I had to, like, pivots overused. I had to change the idea. I had to, like, change the idea. That's why I go on the whole idea of experiments, because you have to think in an experimental nature about everything, because otherwise you put too much weight on everything. You create pressure around everything. It has to work. I have to do it this way. It has to end up like that. And then you box yourself into these absolutes of, like, I can't change direction now, because if I change, it's not going to be the plan. You need plans. I plan religiously. I plan so many things, but within that there is such flexibility to go, okay, after 3 weeks, if that hasn't worked, we're going to shift and alter it this tiny way. So it's all about direction of travel, and everything I'll talk about today doesn't really change from how I think body, brain, business. They're all overlapping each other. I apply all the same principles to everything. It's all about, where do you want to go? Not like, what's the end point? It's like Google Maps. It's like having wayfaring points along the way. It's like the journey. It's the cliche of cliches. The journey is more important than the destination. And I hate when people who've made like loads of money say to people, oh, you know, don't worry about the money. It's not about the money. It is, until it isn't.
Yeah.
Like, I've seen this so many times with founders. Like, they're
right.
like, and a lot of them say, this is the other jarring realization I've had, and this is kind of like not really a positive. It's that so many of them get there and they're unhappy. and that's changed how I think about things as well in terms of direction of travel. This is a theme that's come out in the last 18 months, and I think about this all the time, and it's definitely dramatically changed how I think about my life and how I approach things. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of incredible founders on who've had exits, and I'll ask them the same question: how did it feel? And they were like, oh, it didn't really feel like anything because I had to do an earn out for 2 years. I couldn't leave for 2 years because, as part of the deal, I had to work there for 2 years. I'm like, okay, cool. What did it feel like after 2 years when you walked away? And they'll say, nothing. It felt like nothing.
Wow.
To me,
that's amazing.
That is the saddest thing. And it's Emmet, it's definitely a trend I see all the time. Not every founder, but I can count on the number of one hand that I've had a really cool story where people go, Gary was amazing. And I chatted to a founder last week who had a big exit.
Yeah.
Really good guy. And he is happy. He is having fun with his family. And he's just not doing anything outrageous, but he's having fun. And he literally goes to me, he goes, Gary, I'm happy. And I was like, that is the best, because it's just so sad when people get there at the end and they realize it isn't what they want.
That is really powerful insight, and not shocking, but to hear it is definitely for me. But it's definitely goosebumps moment for me, because I believe there's an analogy for everyone who lives in Ireland that they can relate to, which was the Leaving Cert. Like, your entire education was building up to this state exam, which most young people in Ireland do age 17 or 18, and everything you do from probably the age of 13 to the age of 17, I'm saying this for American listeners, is orientated around this exam, and the kids who are doing it can't wait for it to be over. There's going to be a big blowout. And when you speak to any, for those who did the Leaving Cert and reflect on it, the day they finished the Leaving Cert, they just put down the pencil, went home, got changed. There was no big blowout. And when I look at my son who did the Leaving Cert and his friends, it's the exact same. There's this kind of, right, that's done now. I'll switch on the TV, see what's happening. Like, this end point. The end point is just, you run out of time before you run out of money. That's one of the idioms of life that I really live by. You just have to enjoy the journey. It's one of those things that I really love, that story. And it's quite interesting too, because you can look at entrepreneurs who've made it. And we've spoken about an entrepreneur you've spoken to on your podcast who made an absolute holy fortune. And I'm aware of the house he's built, and honestly, you wouldn't see the likes of it anywhere else. And despite that, having listened to the interview, I just thought, that didn't bring him happiness. Stuff doesn't bring you happiness. It's the journey. No. It's the path. It's the people.
And it's a cliche, and people will be listening, rolling their eyes. But
it's
not us saying it. It's just us having interviewed loads of people.
Yeah.
Who if you interview 300 people, you see patterns and trends, and you kind of go, I would be ridiculous if I didn't sit back and go, what am I learning here?
Yeah.
What am I actually deeply learning? And it's never really. When I started, I always used to think, it's the tips and the tricks and it's the hacks. It is a little, but mainly it's more so. Sit back, think a bit deeper, and just decide what the big things are, what actually matters.
That's
because
right.
We're driven. A lot of the founders, it's addiction. They're driven.
Oh, it is addiction. There's no two ways about it. I look at, I'm a huge Queen fan, and I look at Brian May, the guitarist from Queen, who now is in his mid-70s. Queen recently sold their catalogue to Sony for $1.27 billion, which is double what the Michael Jackson catalogue was bought for. Wow. It's the biggest check ever written for a music catalogue. Brian May has untold wealth, and he still tours. He's not doing it for money. He's doing it because he's addicted to the art. He's addicted to the roar of the crowd, to the performance, to the music. And I think entrepreneurs, when I look at Brian May, I think, that's an entrepreneur. You really, the money is over there, or mightn't be over there, but you're doing it because you feel it's just, there's this drive inside you. You have to keep pushing. It's a fascinating.
And look, that's what makes them. That's what makes them successful, right? That's what makes probably the top 5%. How I think about it is there's probably 90% of people who are like me and you. We go out, we work, we do our best, we graft, we do absolutely as much as we can. And then there's the 10% who are just wired different. They're the ones that get all the attention. They're the Elons and the Steve Jobs of the world.
Yes.
But they're the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And people map themselves on the exception. and they map all the traits and the habits and the quirks. And like sometimes meet young entrepreneurs, I'm like, oh, you're just aping what you think is success. And it's often really unbalanced, misguided success. Like a lot of the founders are either running away from something or running towards something.
All right.
And they're just running.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I've kind of learned this. I was like,
Wow.
okay, they're running away from that trauma or whatever it is, or they're running towards what they think will be happiness. But in reality, I've kind of learned that whatever you are now, you'll be with money. So if you're miserable now, you'll be more miserable with money. If you're
Heaven
a
knows
dickhead
I'm
now,
miserable
you'll be
now.
a bigger dickhead with money. And it's true. I think money and alcohol do the same thing.
Yes.
I think they just
Yeah.
multiply what you already are. They just reveal layers of who you really are and make you either better or worse.
Well, even the lesson that you've taken from all those entrepreneurs about money, let's just say money doesn't make you happy, if we're to reduce it. You hear it from the absolute pinnacle of entrepreneurs. Like to butcher a story by Bill Gates, he said that when he came into his first mega paycheck, he said, you retire a lot of your own financial worries, all of your own financial worries, and then you retire all the financial worries of the people you care for the most, and then you give a bit to charity and you've more left over than you could ever spend, and one day you're queuing for a burger and you realize, I'm getting the exact same burger as the guy in front of me and behind me.
I love that story.
Yeah, and then there's Jensen Huang, the founder of NVIDIA, whose advice I'm sure you heard was, he just wishes he never did it. And when you hear these stories and you hear them over and over again, right down to a more modest entrepreneur who might have sold his business for €500,000 or €1 million, and they still have the same kind of lesson, which is the end point. It's not about that. And when the end point eventually arrives, it's always going to be anticlimactic, because you've got this kind of vision of what's on top of Everest and you're working towards getting there, but it's really the path that you're walking. When it comes to finance and business, is there something that you've gleaned and learned from all these different entrepreneurs that the average person should know but doesn't? So the kind of relationship that these entrepreneurs you've interviewed have had with money, is just or indeed how they treat money, is there something that you've spotted as different?
It's interesting. Like, they're definitely two different things, right? People think, oh, it's just they're good at business to be good at finance. And you know this. Often they're not. They're not very good at finance. They're good at making it.
Yeah.
But they mightn't be good at like deploying it or even spending it.
Yeah.
So there's definitely two different things. It's very important to kind of realize that.
It is so
like,
true.
People like you who are experts in finance, that is very, very different than the guys who are really good at like business. Like, that's their silo, that's their niche. What's their superpower? You know, it's making money, and that could be within a certain industry or whatever it is. Like, just because I think it's important to realize what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I think a lot of good business people, the great ones I meet, are super open about their weaknesses, and they go, nope, don't know anything about that. And I love when people go, I don't know, Gary, I don't know the answer to that. That's not my strength, because then they're truly self-aware as to their strengths, and they just hire people. They go, okay, I need Emmet for this, I need Gary for that, I need John for this, I need Sarah for that. Great, I'm going to be over here doing what I do best. I had Gary Lavin last week. I chatted to him. It's not out yet, but it'll be out in a few weeks. And he was really self-aware. He took on a new CEO and stood aside. And like, the lack of ego that takes is big, because most people want to be CEO. They even just want the title. Like, I know people that just get off on the title alone. It's the lack of like ego is huge in the really good people. They're like, I don't really care what you call me. And like, sometimes I'll have people and I check the details like you do, you know this yourself, going, just get your title correct. What's your title? Founder, co-founder? They're like, I don't care. Call me whatever. Yeah, founder, fine, whatever. Yeah. You know, it's that's not what they're doing it for. Whereas you see a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs, and they just want the title. They want the CEO title on LinkedIn or Instagram, and it's kind of like, that's not what it's about. It doesn't really matter what you call you. The work is the same. So that, you know, it's important to kind of know, to go back to your answer question about you know, what traits do they have. They're just really good at knowing what they're not good at. Yeah, that's what I really have noticed, in that they're really good at knowing what they're not good at, and they're not afraid to hide it. And as I've gone through this journey with the podcast, I've become far more open about myself and just what I feel. I'll be very open about everything that I'm doing, because I don't feel like I need to pretend because I've realized that the good ones don't need to pretend. You don't need to
Yeah.
project this image. And we all do that early in our career. Like, yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. Yeah. And whereas now I'll go, you'll hear me ask this question on the podcast all the time. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
They'll throw out an acronym or like a phrase or like whatever. I'm like, what does that mean? Because too often in life we're afraid to ask the stupid question. I was at an event last week. This person kept asking questions, but they kept prefacing with, now, sorry to ask a silly question, but you're like, stop saying that. Just ask the question. Just have enough self-confidence. Just go, I have a question. What does this so-and-so mean? What does that term mean? What does this mean? Just be comfortable. Just get comfortable just being more open and just being less kind of afraid to say what you actually want.
That touches on, I suppose, a human condition of modesty. Maybe it's an Irish condition. But have you noticed that there's a ceiling when it comes to ambition for Irish founders? A lot of Silicon Valley heads genuinely feel the right to change the world. And I suppose there's an argument. Carlson brothers are Silicon Valley entrepreneurs as much as they are Irish entrepreneurs. They got over there when they were very young. But are the Irish too self-aware to share this mantra?
It's a really interesting question because I'm thinking about it a lot right now, because I was at a conference last week and they were kind of discussing kind of like mindset, and they were talking about kind of like US entrepreneurs and things like that. We have this weird thing in Ireland because we're trying to adopt this like Silicon Valley mindset, but we live in a very, very different world. So we keep butting up against exactly what you said.
Exactly.
Of like, where's our ambition? And they either overcorrect and go, I want to make a dent in the universe. You're like, settle down, Philip. Or it's like they have the very modest thing. But I think we live in a very small island, right? And it depends, what are you building? Like, what are you building? I think a lot of people don't realize what they're building. Why are you building it? What is the distribution? A lot of people start with the product. In reality, you need to look at the distribution. There's a great phrase: first-time founders obsessed about product, second-time founders obsessed about distribution.
Wow.
How are you getting your product to the customers? And in reality, that's the biggest step. You're asking me about lessons from founders. The ones understand that like, how do I get it to them? Because I see it so often. Founders will spend a year, 2 years getting grants and going to this workshop and doing this accelerator program without actually releasing a product.
Yeah.
They'll build and build and build and build, because releasing a product is really hard.
Yeah, it
because
is.
people might go, that's absolutely garbage.
That's
Go
right.
back to the drawing board. It's better to find that out after 12 weeks. So I think that we need to evolve our thinking on this. And I don't know the answer, if I'm very, very honest, because I've thought about this tons and tons and tons. Does Ireland as a country need to become very niche at a couple of really key industries? Because we have a huge amount of US multinationals here. But we still don't have a very distinct identity as to what Ireland excels at. We have a lot of pharma here, we have a lot of other things here, but we don't really have that identity. Like Silicon Valley has that hub where anything is possible, have that mindset. Irish people don't really have that anything is possible mindset yet. Younger people are definitely more confident and willing to punch more. But there's I think we're in, to kind of answer your question in a roundabout way, we're in the middle of a fundamental shift in how the world works. Hybrid, remote, online. We're doing this interview online, right? A couple of years ago, this wouldn't be a thing, right? It wouldn't be a thing.
I think we did. My first foray into online anything was with you on your show, because we all had to run home, and I got an email and we connected, and it was the first time I did a podcast not in the flesh.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. That's
really, really interesting. So I think we're in the middle of a complete shift as into how the world works. I think it's going to level the playing field a lot. It is going to level the playing field, but I think we're in for 5 to 10 years of absolute pain in a lot of industries, because companies are still don't know the answer, and they're reverting back to the old model of like, everyone back to the office. Yeah. I saw Patagonia do it. I was like, that is an absolute joke. Like, you're save the planet, save this, save that. And they're using this like old style, everyone back to the office mentality. And you're like, those days have gone.
They have gone.
You no longer live in that world, guys.
Yeah.
You have to like wake up and go, do I want to have people in the office, or do I want the best people? Because if you are afraid people aren't working right at home, you've hired the wrong people.
You've touched on a few of the points already, but our listeners are prominently stock investors, and you speak to entrepreneurs all the time, of which I'm going to guess probably less than 5% end up floating their business, but they have built something that is a strategic option if they so chose. Have you identified traits in the most successful entrepreneurs you've spoken to that we should look for as stock investors? Because one of the key differentiating factors for a successful stock investment is a passionate, founding, inspiring CEO who's generally the founder. And if you were to name the top 10 most successful business people of all time, in all likelihood, they founded the business that they brought to the stars. So what I look for, and the question I'm asking you, is what have you spotted in those successful entrepreneurs that you believe differentiates them?
There's two things.
Yeah.
Time.
Say again.
Time, number one.
Time.
You'll have heard this loads of times. Time. It's not, the old cliche of it's not time in the market. It's not timing the market. It's time in the market.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with them. They realize this is a long game.
Right.
And the really clever ones are playing the infinite game. They're not like, I need to sell this in 5 years.
That.
They're playing the infinite game. They realize this is a game they want to play forever. They're not like, I need to retire at 65, which means I need to sell this business at 63 and then have my 2 years earn out. They're playing the infinite game. They love what they do. And you have to be passionate about it. You have to really have a passion. Otherwise, you're doing this like functional, transactional thing. You may as well have a job if that's how you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because unless you're fully willing to give this forever, minimum 10 to 20 years, the time horizons are off when people think about businesses. They think, I'm going to start a business. You're like, cool. Have you made your 10-year plan?
Yeah.
And I did this with a workshop last week. I did with 12 entrepreneurs, did a workshop, and I got them to think 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, 1 year.
Yeah.
The 10 years just absolutely stumped them.
Right.
And I did it intentionally to stump them
because
I needed them to see how hard it is to think long term. The 5 years started to get a bit clearer. The 3 years was pretty clear. The 1 year they were razor locked on in. I was like, the 10 years will completely change. But it was bringing them back to the lesson on the direction of travel. If you don't have a rough direction of travel, you'll let the winds take you wherever you're going to go. It's like a ship. You'll just go where the winds blow you. You're aiming for America and you end up in Antarctica.
Yeah.
You have to have a plan, a long-term plan. So the great ones realize they don't think in months, quarters, years. You talked about floating there. Obviously, when people float, they're under the gun. Quarterly reports, get it done. I see this a lot with with companies who take on venture capital. They're pretty miserable.
Well, it's funny. And before you tell us number two, honestly, that's incredible, Gary, because the greatest stock investors think in multiples of decades. And that sounds ridiculous because we only have, I suppose, with good innings, 6 decades as adults, but you should really think as a stock investor as a minimum in 2 decades, ideally 3, better 4, and better 5, and if you can manage 6. So I absolutely, and I believe the long term is always, short term is the enemy of the long term, and people totally over-index the short term and ignore the long term. Love that answer. So time was the first one, Gary. What's the second that you mentioned?
Yeah, I love that, the time thing. It really is, like as you said, thinking in decades. And just to close off that loop, you don't have to hold everything for decades. You don't have to be committed to that for decades. It will change. You don't have to hold on tight, but it's being able to get yourself into that mindset of, it's quite freeing. When I started thinking of the podcast in terms of like, what will this look like in 10, 15 years? I just felt better. I was like, okay, I'm under less pressure now. It didn't dim my ambition. It didn't dim what I want to do. But I think social media definitely has a role to play in terms of the instant gratification we now seek in life. We seek instant gratification on all things because everything is available to us now. I can go on Amazon, I see a cool book on your shelf, I can go on Amazon, I can have it in the morning. There's no real delayed gratification. So you have to kind of build that in where you can, and have like these good guardrails that kind of delay the gratification. To go to the second point, they keep the main thing the main thing. So if you've 20 different products, 1 or 2 of them will result in 80% of the profits. And they realize that, and they're not emotional about it. They don't have their pets. They don't have, they're like, oh, I love that product though. They're purely rational, and they keep the main thing the main thing. They don't let side quests divert them off from the main thing. The main business will be 80% of whatever X it is, whatever the product is, X, right? Keep X the center focus of the business. You'll experiment, but when you find the 80-20, they go hard on the 80-20, and they don't start messing around trying to pick up 1% here. They're like, focus on the main thing, because it takes so much work. You know this. It takes so much work to get where you want to go. Whereas if you're diverting your focus into 10 different buckets, there's just not enough time in the day. You have to keep the main thing the main thing. So experiment. But when you find the main thing that's working, double, triple, quadruple down on it, and really leverage that, because things will change quite quickly, and you have to make sure that when you do hit the thing, that you get as much value out of it as possible, because everything changes. If COVID has taught us nothing is cemented, nothing is forever, nothing lasts. Life goes in seasons. Businesses go in seasons. It's never up and to the right for every business all the time. So when you're getting a summer season, you have to realize the sun is out, the shades are on, and the top is off. You have to really enjoy it and go for it, because as a business owner, it's hard yards a lot of the time.
Oh, it is, yeah.
But you have to, when you do get that thing, you're like, oh, this is working now. Okay.
Yeah.
The temptation as entrepreneurs is that you get distracted. You're like, oh, look at that over there. Look at AI. AI is just my pet peeve at the minute.
Right.
It's just my pet peeve. Everyone's like distracted by AI. Whereas the good companies are just going, okay, how does that improve what we're already doing?
Yeah.
They're not like, let's launch a new AI business. I was at a conference recently. Everyone was .ai. It was absolutely comical. Like everyone just suddenly, I don't know how Ireland found so many AI experts in the last 18 months, but they're all out of the woodwork. They were the blockchain and crypto people a few years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's it. The 80-20, keep the main thing, and time.
Actually, it's funny because my colleague Frank said to me recently, plan B is the enemy of plan A. And I just thought it was such a, there was so much in that. It's so true. Just, find what works and make it work better. Don't get distracted. I was previously the king of distractions. MyWallSt in its early days had an awful lot of things hanging off it, and we've shed a lot of coats, and we're going down to that 80%. I should have asked.
And you have to.
You have to
test. You have to figure it out, because you don't know, and it's okay not to know. That's another thing that great entrepreneurs, they're okay saying, I don't know. I'm going to figure it out. When you have such confidence and certainty at an early stage, chances are you're not right, and that can again play on the ego side of things. Your ego can then force you down a road whereby you're like, oh, I can't admit I'm wrong now because I was so bullish and I rubbed it in everyone's faces for so long. So you have to be able to change.
I've never had anyone on my podcast before and be completely unaware as to whether or not they buy shares. So are you a stock investor?
Yes.
Okay.
I am.
Can you describe...
There'd be an end of the interview if I said no, right?
No, not at all. This is fascinating. Okay, so without trying to put you on the spot, would you be able to describe your stock investment philosophy?
Good question. I didn't really have one.
Yeah.
I was just doing, to be honest, I was following what I said earlier. I just put in a set amount every month.
I see.
Well,
that's great.
And I don't overthink it. I just set the amount every month. Started this probably 2020, I think.
Yeah.
I think 2020 was the first time I sat down and went, right, what do I want and what do I think? And I've made other investments in the past, and it's like, I just want to have like a balanced portfolio all across my life of all things. Just balance in all things is kind of the goal, right? So you kind of you don't have to, but I think it makes sense to put some of your money into stocks.
Yeah.
And then what I'll look at is like, are they products I use? Are they products that my guests use? So I'll generally look at that. Look at what do you work with? What do you work on? what suppliers do you work with, what's coming up. I'll talk to them about all that kind of stuff of like, because they're the ones, right? They're the ones figuring it out. You don't have to figure out everything from scratch yourself, because otherwise no one has the time, right? There's experts like you who have the time to then go, right, and it takes you probably months to go, yeah, this is a good stock. The average person doesn't know. I don't know. I don't have the skills, the time to figure out and look at, go, what's a good stock? So I try to figure out what are other people using? What do I feel there's growth in? And what do I feel that I'd be happy to hold? Again, going back to the thing, like I call it like the Willow rule. So my daughter Willow was born like 18 months ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much. What would I be happy holding if I never had to sell until she was ready to sell them when she was 18?
Right.
Like, what would I hold for 18 years? And what people don't change, technology does. So I'm thinking, what good things can we hold on to?
Did you buy her Disney?
You hear this all the time. I did. Yeah.
Right.
What I actually did buy Disney. What, like, you hear this all the time. And again, it goes back to our original conversation about like, what do you hear from other people that we just ignore all the time? And you hear this all the time. I heard it yesterday. That's a perfect example. I heard it yesterday. A guy had 10,000 Amazon shares at like something like $5, and he sold them because they were dipped. And he's like, if I can just get out of this now at evens. So he sold them back at 5.
Wow.
And he was talking about it yesterday. He goes, I don't even think about it, because you can't drive yourself mad, because otherwise, he's I made the right decision for me at the right time. And I thought that was very, very, very balanced. But
this is
Most
true.
people would be fuming.
You have just described a very famous book called One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch, and what you've done, the way you've codified your investing life, your philosophy is aligned with probably the greatest investment tome ever written. So you don't really need to double think about it.
So wise, and I don't even know it.
Honestly, damn, if you hadn't written that book, you could have done it.
It's the basics, though, isn't it? Like, it is the basics. I do allow myself a little bit of play time, though, in terms of like, I apply this thing called chaos capital. So like, I'll have a little bit of money set aside to scratch that itch, allow that kind of like. That'll allow that kind of like entrepreneur thing to just, allow it to go off in a controlled way.
Unbelievable you say that, because there's a Wall Street journalist called Jason Zweig who's written a couple of books, one of which is called Your Money and Your Brain, and he describes the function, how brain interacts with money, and how it almost has a unique set of thought processes reserved because, well, we all know why. But he did say there is a part of the brain more prevalent in the male brain that needs a flutter, which is why the horse racing industry is so big. And there you go, you also have just acknowledged that. So honestly, you're wise beyond your years, Mr. Gary Fox. There you go. You always ask your guests to invest, if they could invest, I think it's €1 million in one person. Now I'm going to alter that for the sake of this podcast. So if you had €1 million to invest in anything, it could be as boring as a treasury bond, or your own crypto token, or shares in Disney. But if you had $1 million to drop on just one, anything at all, where would you deploy it?
If it's just in an investable asset, in terms of like an actual financial asset, if it was $1 million, you were like, here's $1 million, do whatever, I'd invest in myself. If it was $1 million into an investable asset, I would literally pick a fund. That's as boring as I would be, because I like certainty in certain things. Again, goes back to our original point. I've got crypto. I've done really well out of it. I was in super early. I don't touch it.
Nice.
I just leave it there. Don't think about it. So the same with funds. I would just invest. I've done the property thing. It's not great. I have had one good and one bad, but I would just invest in a fund. I do the S&P and just leave it there for 15 years.
Well, there's no wrong answer to that question, but they are the right answers. Invest in yourself and invest in a fund if you're not into it. I think that's a wonderful answer. Before we wrap, I suppose, Gary, I'd like to just ask you about favorite books or resources for business people, apart from the Entrepreneur Experiment, of course, which I hope our listeners tune into and subscribe to. But what are your favorite books or resources for business people, professionals, entrepreneurs, just people on the street? People who just love the sport of business and commerce. What resources?
I love reading. I absolutely love reading. I have 2 books on the go at all times. I read non-fiction over a morning coffee, and I read fiction at night just to go to a different world.
Right.
And I have for as long as I can remember in my life. I love reading. When people always ask me for like, what book do you recommend? I'm like, what problem are you trying to solve? And I always what's the first problem? I'm not going to deviate from your answer. I'm going to give you an answer, but I always say when people ask me for a book recommendation, I'm like, what are you trying to figure out right now?
Right.
What are the key things?
Yeah.
Because I can recommend a book and people go, that was absolute garbage, Gary. And I've done that myself. I've read a book. I've read like 5 chapters of a book and went,
Yeah.
no.
Same.
I literally have one right there. Cal Newport, Slow Productivity. Started it. 5 chapters in. I'm like, I'm going to sit this down and I'm going to come back to it later because I'm just not in that headspace
I do that a lot
at
as
the minute.
well.
And it's fine.
Yeah.
It's okay to start and then not continue. The big one I recommend all the time is Atomic Habits. So Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Yeah.
Really invaluable. Psychology and Money by Morgan Housel.
Yeah. I've had Morgan on this podcast actually.
No way.
Yeah.
Incredible. Great company. Love it. And then I love Ryan Holiday's books. So Courage is Calling, Right Thing, Right Time, Ego is the Enemy. I love psychology. I'm really and again, it's because I'm in that phase of my life where I'm trying to figure myself out. After 2020, I was like, right, I need to figure myself out and figure out my own psychology. There's a great one, which I think every entrepreneur should read, whether you have an ADHD diagnosis or not. It's called Faster Than Normal by Peter Sharkman. He has ADHD, but he describes the tactics and tools and literally his day for how his mind works. He's like, I used to get distracted a lot. Okay. Couldn't focus. Okay. I would hop from project to project. Okay. I would pick things up and leave them down. Okay. And he talks through what he did to then turn that into a superpower. So he keeps talking about it as a superpower. It's a really, really good. The Power of Compounding is the other one. It's really, really good. Again, the 1%. This is where all my kind of like psychology have come from. A great starting point is probably The Daily Laws, probably by Robert Greene.
The Daily Laws, actually.
The Daily Laws. It touches on a lot of psychology. You can just, again, I love these kind of like books you can just like read a couple of chapters or not. And then there's another one by Robert Greene, The Laws of Human Nature. It's behind me on the shelf there.
Yeah.
Really good. Quite heavy though. You really have to be into psychology to kind of give it a go. And the rest of them are all biographies. I love biographies.
Yeah, so do I. Is the Daily Laws, if difficulty of reading from 1 to 10, is it an easy read or is it as...
Yes, very easy because it's literally by day. You can literally read one thing by day.
Oh, great.
So if you're not a reader, it's good.
Yeah. What's your favourite pop-up book? I'm only kidding.
Exactly. That's my favorite children's book. The Daily Stoic is another one. If you're not a big reader, these are good books for people who aren't good big readers. And then again, I have a really eclectic mix. Whatever I'm into, I'll be reading a health book. I'll be reading Lifespan by David Sinclair. I'll be reading all these different books at different times.
Are you a book hoarder or do you give them away when you're done?
Oh, I keep them all.
Do you? I used to keep
I hoard
them all.
nothing. Yeah. I hoard nothing. We are massive minimalists.
Yeah.
Like we used to live on a barge, so we had to be minimalists.
Did you?
Yeah. But since then, I cull every quarter. I go through my wardrobe, cull everything. I will cull everything in my life except my books.
Right. I got there recently because this background of mine obviously is very curated, and I had tons of books stuffed in those shelves and in the presses below and all around this whole office and out in the shed, and I went for a big mega cleanup because I very, very rarely read anything twice. There's a few I pick up and dip into again, but only for a few seconds. It's kind of like when I've read it, I've conquered it, and I hope something sticks and I just move on.
Yeah.
So I did.
What I've started doing is doing the notes thing. I'll go back through. I'll read a book with a pen, and then I'll translate them to a note card. But I've books everywhere. Like why I don't hoard is that I'll only buy non-fiction, and I'll read fiction on the Kindle. So it kind of is a bit of a good way of keeping, because a lot of fiction books, you're never going to read them again. Yeah. So I read them on the Kindle if it's fiction.
Did you ever read Ian Banks?
Ian Banks,
Scottish
thriller writer.
Yes, Scottish. He wrote under two names, Ian Banks and Ian M. Banks. Great. Anyway, look, not relevant. Gary, really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so glad you joined me on our podcast. And sure, if you're ever stuck for a man on your own, just give me a shout. I'm sure you won't.
We might have to revisit. That's what I'm actually having fun with at the minute, because I'm at it so long now. I'm at it 5.5 years, coming up on 5.5 years. I'm now getting to revisit it. I love it because 5 years on, people's businesses have entirely changed. So it's cool.
That's very interesting. You're right. I mean, for a start, you're putting on your guests to go off and listen to what they said 5 years ago. And I have never listened.
Having a podcast has made me more consistent as a person, because you can't keep flip-flopping. You can't go, oh, I think this week, I think that next week, I think this week. You have to be more consistent. But I'm loving it, going back now and revisiting. Perfect example, I had Gary Lavin on
last week.
Last week, but also 4.5 years ago.
Oh, I see.
Like, their business is just a rocket ship now. He's like, it was popular then, but now it's everywhere.
And Gary Lavin
just
founded
through VitHit.
I'm looking forward to listening to that. Actually, I didn't know that he was the founder of VitHit. Wow, that's gone. Looking forward to listening to that. Okay, well, that's that. So, Gary, to our listeners, make sure you tune into the Entrepreneur Experiment on all the usual podcast stores, and tune in next week, where Mike will return and we'll get back with the regular programming of finding and discussing the next big thing. Gary, hope you have a great week. Thank you for joining me, and stay well.
Thank you so much, Emmet. Really enjoyed that.